Hello and welcome to today's webinar, 4 Tips to Win the War on Ransomware. This event is brought to you in partnership with Veeam and DP3 Tech. It will be our special guest. Thank you so much for joining us on this webinar. We've got a great event lined up for you today. Always exciting to have Veeam on the webinar series here. So again, thank you so much for joining us. Before we jump into it, just a little bit that you should know about today's event. You should know we want this to be educational. We will be doing a dedicated Q&A session at the end of the webinar, so we encourage you to use the questions box there. It's on your left-hand side of the audience console, and I can call your attention to it that way. But yeah, check out the questions box. We encourage you to use that, and we'll be queuing up the best questions for that Q&A session at the end of the presentation. We also have some links there in the handouts tab. Top one, of course, is to Veeam. The second one is to the Veeam Live event that's coming up. Make sure that you check that out. You'll be learning about that on the webinar as well. And then finally, there's a link to today's slide deck presentation that you can download and peruse after the webinar. Finally, we'll have the winner. Finally, we'll be announcing the winner, I should say, of the Amazon $300 gift card at the end of today's webinar. If you're watching this on demand, I'm sorry, the drawing has already occurred. The prize terms and conditions can be found in the handouts tab. And then lastly, I guess I should mention, my name is David Davis, and I'll be serving as the moderator on today's webinar. And with that, I'm excited to introduce you to today's expert presenters. They are Mr. Rick Vanover, Director of Technical Product Marketing at Veeam, and special guest, Mr. Charlie Altenbach, Founder and Managing Director of DP3 Tech. Rick, Charlie, thank you so much for being on.
Well, cheers. And Charlie, hey, thanks for joining me on this. We're happy to go at this. And Charlie, you want to do a quick intro of yourself?
Sure, yeah. My name is Charlie Altenbach. I appreciate the opportunity to be here with everybody today. I am the founder and managing director of DP3 Tech. We provide IT and cybersecurity solutions to small and medium-sized businesses. And prior to founding DP3 Tech, I was a CIO and IT director at law firms here in Chicago. In those roles, I was responsible for designing and implementing the firm's cybersecurity programs, including developing security awareness training programs for the firm's employees. And yeah, again, thank you for the opportunity to be here with everybody today.
3 things caught me in that, Charlie. You said cybersecurity twice, and then you said security once, and I did that intentionally. I wanted Charlie on this call, friends, because his expertise is a natural segue to what Veeam does in backup, to practicing expertise that Charlie brings here. And you can follow him on Twitter at Chaz1121 and myself at Rick Vanover. So yeah, we're going to go over 4 tips to win the war on ransomware. And you know, this is a threat we deal with every day. And I think that the way to do it is a combination of many things. And we're going to pack it into 4 top level tips. And here's our agenda. So I'm going to start with an overview of the Threadscape. And this changes all the time. Every time I look in the news or adjust to the threat behavior, right? So I'm going to give you the latest insight to what I have, and this changes weekly, it seems. We're going to go over to some practical advice from Charlie. A lot of his advice will align very well to what you do on the early side of things, which I think is arguably most effective. You know, some things are human, some things are technology related on the early, like before ransomware gets inside of it. But then at the end of the day, how can Veeam help? If ransomware gets in, I have a mindset that your only option is to restore data, but that's only going to go well if you do it right. And then we're going to go through some Q&A. So here on the platform, drop your questions in. David, as our moderator and host here, will make sure that those questions get fielded towards the end. So let's jump into it. So the 4 tips right here. This is all you need to do, right? So we're done. Well, not really. I think that it breaks down into these areas. 1, education, and users and administrators. You know, go back to Charlie's comment. You know, when he introduced himself, he talked about awareness training on the security side. That's up and down. Anybody using a computer needs to be educated here. And just by being on this webinar, you're taking a very important and positive first step. I think that also your backup and recovery implementation is very important. Veeam can help there, but we're going to go through some tips that actually will align to whatever you're doing. So everybody can learn something, even if you're not using Veeam. And then 3, remediation plan. This is the preparation needed when things go wrong. And I'd go so far to say is almost prepare to have to deal with this. If I was doing this in person, I would ask people to raise their hands if you've ever had a ransomware incident, and you would be shocked how many people do indeed raise their hands. And then the other side of it is make sure you have expert advice at the ready. Do you have cybersecurity experts? Do you have tech support for the different platforms you use at the ready? You don't want to have to figure that out. So let's get into it. So the first thing I like to say is that really there is no single magic bullet, no single silver bullet that will just make this problem go away, other than de-digitizing, which obviously is not an option in today's world. I think you go about being prepared by having a layered defense. And the thought here is that all the different ransomware threats, which I'll go into in a second, they behave differently. So you almost need to have layers of protection that can align to certain behaviors and certain types. And the reality is that different organizations may be subject to different types of threats. That's actually what we're seeing now more than ever. Targeted threats to a large multinational. You see those in the news. I've dissected from others who share a little bit more details on those threats. They're very advanced. They are very targeted to these large organizations, and they are not messing around. And that leads me to kind of this reality here. Ransomware is not just encryption, right? I grew up thinking that ransomware would just encrypt my files and okay, great. Veeam lives in a backup world, we can recover. But the reality is some of them are very, very different. One of the things that I had seen in fact, I spoke to our tech support team about this recently. There was a ransomware strain that went in and, no joke, made a native SQL Server encryption call. So yes, that's encrypting data, but it's native through SQL Server. So you had to just go buy the key, which was really interesting, right? But there's also deletion, where these ransomware behaviors will continually to delete files and then delete more and more even faster. And the ransom is to stop the deletion. There's also extortion, which leaves all your data on premises or wherever it is, but also has a copy of it in the cloud or on the dark web that's available for the highest bidder. But then flip that around, if you don't pay the ransom to decrypt the local encrypted copy, some of them will also have a secondary up in the cloud that they'll sell on the dark web. So it's like there's all these bizarre behaviors going on. And then the third is a phenomena called dwell and awareness. And dwell and awareness is one that really gets me. And I'm going to go into a specific example here in a second. But dwelling and awareness are a phenomena where, I'll just give you a scenario. Ransomware is in the environment. It's not encrypting or deleting or extorting or anything else, but it's just taking a look. Seeing what's going on, seeing what's in place. That is the behavior that scares me the most, because it's really hard to defend against. Now, that being said, I don't want to scare you away. We can defend against that in today's world, but I just want you all to be aware of the different behaviors. Therefore, some of these threats will actually be aware of what type of backup you have, of what type of storage you have, of what type of hypervisors, etc. One of the recent examples I had was a organization that beat ransomware. They beat it with Veeam, but they shared the story at the VeeamON event in June. And the threat actors, it was a very specific ransomware strain that we've heard of before, but it was almost refactored specifically for this organization. It actually went and printed out on every network printer the ransom note to kind of scare the users, right? So think about some of these behaviors. It's really, really getting advanced, but that's okay. We have some ways to protect against this. Now, the newest worst news is that there's an emerging behavior of what I want to call basically being walked in. And if you don't read threat post, and this is the first of many links that we have here in the webinar, and as David said in the intro, we have the availability to download these slides in a PDF form. So no need to take screenshots. You can download these slide decks for your ongoing resource usage. But anyways, the newest post over here, threat post, and I think it's still on the front page, is basically buying network access. Oh my goodness. Can you imagine? Oh yeah, I'll sell you a domain admin account or something like that. Wow. So that makes dwell and awareness that much easier, right? Combining that with all the popular threat actors, right? Just taking a malicious admin and you're in an incredible situation of trouble, if you ask me. And when I think about these different phenomena, I wonder about how we can defend against these. Okay, so anytime I see these good news, bad news situations, that's my first line of questioning. How do we prepare for this? Well, the good news is we can do things that can restore the data, get you out of these problems, right? There's emerging threats. There's always going to be these types of behaviors, but if you're having the threat actors be walked in, that really becomes a problem. Now, in this article, what I thought was very interesting, and I put it in green at the bottom, RDP. I love RDP. I use it all the time. But that becomes one of the really important vehicles for these types of threat actors, which leads me to my next point here. Generally speaking, threats operate a number of different ways, but they get in through a short number of common entry modes. So here's another one of the good links I want to highlight from Coveware, and actually everything at Coveware's blog is really helpful. At the end of last year, they did a survey of where ransomware comes in, and I was shocked to see that 58% of it comes in from RDP or other remote access capabilities being compromised. It blows my mind, but I still hear situations or I see people doing it where they'll use RDP over the internet. Oh, I'll just change the port. Yeah, no, can't do that. And then I found in this example, 26% were exploited via phish and 13 from vulnerabilities. Now that's the end of 2020. They actually, into the midway point of this year, stopped publishing the actual number. They have just a visual graph that you can't precisely get the number. RDP has gone up a little bit, and I'm not surprised at all because of the shift in work from home, right? So this is an area that I think is really going to continue to be a risk with remote access. If you go back to March, what was the phenomena? Did you need to have remote access right? Or did you need to implement massive remote access right now? Well, people needed to implement it right now. And that was what kind of predicated this. So it's a great time to go reset that and get the configuration right. The other area, phish, which I thought was, going into my ransomware research a few years ago, I thought that's where it all started, but it's got a good position, but it's by far not the strongest. And then vulnerabilities and updates. And so my angle here is, take WannaCry from like 2016, right? That was an exploit of something that was patched a year or so before. So we should be doing updates anyways, right? So my thought is, if we have training on email phish attacks, if we have advanced patching and updating, and if we get remote access done right, we can really kind of mitigate 97 or so percent of the attack vectors. And the 3% can be a very scary 3%, right? That can be the insiders, the assisted attacks like the previous ones. And, there's no single defense, but I want to really make sure that the common threat actors are identified and mitigated. Now, I think, Charlie, I think you're going to talk about some tools here in a second on like a desktop or any type of system type of scan and recovery. Do you use any of these by chance on your favorite list?
Yeah, Hitman Pro is one that semi recently I've gravitated towards. But yeah, that's a great tool to be aware of and to be educated about. It can really help if you're ever in a pinch and you are subjected to any type of malware, that is a great tool to be aware of, and as well as these others, in terms of recovery efforts, maybe after a breach. So yeah, absolutely. All three of these are on the list, and I, like I said, Hitman Pro is one that I've put into practice semi recently, and really have seen some great benefits from using that specifically.
Yeah, and thank you, Charlie. And it's really interesting to note that different people have different preferences, right? I've gone through a number of things myself, and Hitman comes up as one of the most highly recommended ones. Myself, I kind of gravitated to the Eset free online scanner, and that's just by usability and personal preference above all. But I think it's important to just have familiarity with a couple of these, and let me explain why. I may, as a corporate citizen or even an IT administrator, like those of you listening on this webinar, you may make a decision that on the desktop we're using, I'm making up something, Symantec Endpoint tool. On the server, we're going to use Windows Defender with a advanced threat detection, just making up a scenario. It's very possible that a threat may have different behavior on different protection tools. And these tools are a good way to, if you have a suspected threat in place, it might make sense to come in offline. So the free online scanner, I know from Eset, you can download the definitions, latest and greatest, and go at it. Isolation is a really important thing in a possible ransomware activity scenario. So having these other kind of, I don't want to call it out of band, but a second opinion, right, in medical doctor terms, right, these are really good to have. So I really highly recommend familiarity and use of one or more of these. Now, the other thing to note is that if you're in a ransomware situation, especially established threats, there's a number of tools. The ID ransomware tool is one of them, where you can, see if a free decryption is available. This is one of those things that if it's been solved, we can potentially think of it like a grassroots effort where we can get it decrypted to avoid, paying the ransom. But keep in mind, I really advocate being able to restore your data above all. But if you're in a situation, especially maybe some endpoints that you didn't back up, then first of all, after you get this fixed, start backing them up. But then if you need to decrypt and get some data, this might be a scenario to look at. There's another tool, the Nomoreransome Project. Now, this one actually started from law enforcement efforts that have been in place to get people out of the problem. There's investigations that go through. And if any of you listening on the webinar have been involved with a ransomware situation, maybe you've had a law enforcement type of conversation or involvement, but this is a resource as well. Now, those are a couple of different tools, but I've saved my favorite for last. The PC security channel. Now, I highly recommend you check this out. Now, again, a couple of links as well for the listeners. You can download this presentation here. I don't know if any of you listening here have any small children. I have two, and they love their YouTube. I like it too, but I don't subscribe to anything. They subscribe to everything. In fact, every time I look at their devices, it's like just notifications of all these posted videos. How do they watch anything? I subscribe to one YouTube channel, this one, the PC security channel, and I highly recommend you at least check out these resources. Leo is an expert in the field, and Leo will go through some of the different ransomwares, install them in an isolated environment. He likes to do virtual machine sandboxing. He'll show you the behavior, show you how advanced and targeted they can be. He'll also go and show you the different antivirus tools and how they can respond against different threats. And it's really interesting because different threats behave differently against different antiviruses. So it's really interesting to watch these behaviors. I think this is, again, on the front end, the preparation. So from a prevention detection standpoint, which is good, at the end of the day, a backup, if it needs to come to that to be restored, is something we need to consider as well. Highly recommend Leo. So that being said, I want to turn it over to Charlie. And it's kind of a funny story that Charlie and I have. I was kind of reaching out to different experts I know, and I'm like, does anybody have some advice that they want to share? And Charlie was one of the first people to pipe up here. And so I've asked Charlie to share some of his practical tips and, from his intro, on that cybersecurity and other types of expertise that he provides. I think that everybody can benefit from that. So Charlie, thanks for being with us. And what are some of your practical tips?
Yeah, I appreciate it, Rick. And that's just really quickly commenting on your prior slide there about the PC security channel. That's something that I have recently gravitated towards as well. And it's really interesting to see how the different ransomware different ransomwares that are out there, how they react to different tools, and to be able to see that kind of live, it's a good way to kind of prepare yourself for what can potentially happen. So that's a great educational piece that, again, I would just double down on what Rick had to say about checking out that YouTube channel. It is very, very interesting, informative, and kind of fun to watch, honestly. In regards to some other things that I recommend, I'm not necessarily going to be reinventing the wheel here, but I will say that when I am brought in as a security consultant, sometimes either during or after a breach, I continue to see these types of things not in play and not configured in the environment. When I get a call that saying, "Hey, such and such organization has just been ransomed. Can you come in and help?" One of the first things that I ask, and I almost always know the answer at this point, is, do they have two-factor authentication in place? And oftentimes when they've been breached, the simple answer is no, they don't. So just as a baseline, absolutely at this point need to have two-factor authentication in place. It's just a great base preventative measure. What these malicious actors will do is, they'll get access to an email account within an organization that doesn't have two-factor turned on. They find the password for sale on the dark web or have some other means of acquiring it. But once they have the credential and they're able to get access to the email, from there, they're able to start to learn about the organization and learn about different customer relationships and who the key players are within the organization. And then they're able to target those people as a means of kind of breaking into the front door, if you will. So highly recommend two-factor. Another one is good password hygiene, and again, not reinventing the wheel, but having a strong, unique password for every one of your accounts, at work, at home, it doesn't matter. Using a password manager to help automate this process, it goes a long way in terms of limiting your exposure. If a credential does get leaked in a breach by a third party that you're using, again, that's an easy way to get in the front door. Say, for example, Facebook or Dropbox or whomever, if a breach occurs and your credentials are found in that breach and you are reusing that password at work or for another key account, there you go. Now they have access to not only the breached account password, but obviously anywhere else where that password is in use. A good password manager, again, goes a long way, like a LastPass or OnePass, KeyPass, as an example. Highly recommend checking those tools out. Security awareness training within the organization is a great means of, again, limiting your exposure, limiting risk. It's all about education at the end of the day. If folks can learn how to identify phishing emails and things of that nature it's going to help prevent from a user from clicking the link that lets the bad actor again in the front door, and then from there, they're able to move around inside of the network, find the key servers and components within inside the network, and get a foothold on the network. And as Rick mentioned previously, kind of laying dormant in the network and learning about the organization and learning really where to focus their efforts in terms of maximizing a potential return with their ransomware attack. So Rick, I think we can go to the next slide here. And I'll leave it to the expert here in regards to data backups. But I will say again, when I've been involved in and brought into situations where there's been a ransomware, and we've attempted on several occasions to just recover, not even worry about paying the ransom, just recover. You always think that you have that capability until you're in the situation of dealing with a ransomware attack and actually having to recover from data backups. And you want to make sure that you have a great product, obviously. That goes without being said. Equally important, you want to be testing those backups. You don't want to be in a situation where the first time that you're testing your data backup is in the middle of a ransomware attack. Oftentimes, I've found that organizations have been able to recover some data, but not necessarily all of it. And sometimes, the portions that are irrecoverable are the portions that are the most important to the company or the organization, and they end up having to, put forth the effort of, the hours and hours of recovery work because maybe it wasn't the right product for the job. But in addition to all that lost time while trying to bring the systems back online during the attack and after the attack, they end up even having to still pay the ransom because they weren't able to, as I mentioned, recover the most critical data that they need to, get the company back online and doing business again. And the last point I have here, and again, I'll reference the PC Security YouTube channel, where you can actually see this in action, the endpoint detection and response. So these are next generation anti-malware, antivirus products that use things like AI and machine learning to not only rely on virus definitions per se, but they also rely on behavioral history of the computers to more quickly shut the door on ransomware specifically. And as a real world example, I was engaged in a recovery effort not too long ago where a traditional antivirus product was installed. We actually went through recovery efforts and we were able to bring the company back online, but the attack actually kept reappearing and trying to reinfect the systems. And it wasn't until we had deployed an EDR solution, it wasn't until then that we were actually able to completely stomp out the fire per se and get the ransomware completely evicted from the environment. So I know that was a lot, but a lot of it is kind of, basic, not necessarily the easy button that you can press, but just following some basic guidelines, doing simple things like two-factor authentication and good password hygiene. Again, not reinventing the wheel, but just really being really, really solid and good about those basic things. In addition to making sure you have some of the right technologies in place, like the right data backup provider and the right plans in place, and having tested and tried those things prior to any kind of incident, it can really, really go a long way. And with that, I think I'll hand it back over to Rick to I think dive into some specifics about Veeam.
No, thanks, Charlie. And a couple comments that I think are very important for the listeners. Data backups and then endpoint detection and response. I think kind of an undertone here is that we probably want to have both of these solutions really on everything. Endpoints, of course, data center and cloud workloads. And I think that's important because of the entry modes. And any device, any connection point become part of the problem now. So for those of you who maybe don't back up endpoints or don't take EDR seriously on the endpoints or as seriously on the data center or whatever, now might be the time to kind of prepare for anything, anywhere, if that makes any sense. So, yeah, again, thank you for that, Charlie. So how can Veeam help, or how can your backup solution help, right? This is why Veeam's in business. This is what we're here to do. I a lot of times explain to Veeam, what do we do? People know us about backup and recovery and more, but it kind of aligns to the Threadscape here is real simple. Veeam provides resiliency against that ransomware threat. That's it. Now, the reality is it's how you implement it. And the same thing goes for anything, detection tools, even your network and security configurations that you might have in your organization. But when a threat comes in, I really like the angle of recovery. I feel that's the only way out. From there, that is delivered and executed upon by a portable data format. And that at first glance may sound a little tacky to say, well, how does that apply to ransomware? Well, it actually can be very significant because of the last point of Veeam being software defined, hardware agnostic, and cloud ready. These are the characteristics you should have, in my opinion, when it comes to dealing with this threat. Let me explain. If you have ransomware in your environment, you may not trust your environment to restore to. I spoke with one individual who beat ransomware with Veeam. They had a very interesting phenomena. This particular environment was a Hyper-V environment. And, back to Charlie's first question, did you have MFA turned on? No. For this Hyper-V environment, did you have a different set of credentials or a different management domain for your Hyper-V cluster versus your actual systems? And they said no. So what does that mean? The moment that one account got compromised, up and down the stack was compromised. So think of that magnitude of that particular type of problem. They didn't trust the cluster. So they had a decision. Do we restore to Azure? Do I go to the local computer store and buy fancy laptops and restore there? Or do I buy fancy desktops and make them servers and restore there? What they actually did was they had to rebuild that cluster in a new format with different security boundaries, and then they were able to restore. Now, that story was available at Veeam On in June. You can replay that. Really, really good story. But anyways, the thought is by being able to restore anywhere, you have some flexibility. Sometimes you can restore to a service provider. You could restore to the cloud. That portable data format comes in very handy there because you may not trust where you came from when you want to go when it comes to where you're going to restore to. And then to double down on that, I'd recommend, much like organizations, to Charlie's advice, having not done restores, think about having investments in automation. Because if you need to rebuild a cluster, a target environment, that might take you some time. Quote unquote, greenfield IT is hard to do. It takes some time. But if you have an automated deployment with Puppet, Chef, Ansible, Chocolatey, you can actually save yourself a lot of time, but you don't want to be restoring from ransomware to learn how to do that. So that's a practical tip. A lot of security experts are familiar with this. I think it's the NIST cybersecurity framework. And this is a framework that applies to a lot of different scenarios, not just Veeam or ransomware. But when I take what Veeam does from a ransomware resiliency perspective in regards to our capabilities, Veeam can align to a lot of these different steps really easy. From tagging data and knowing where your data is to having the protection you need. And I'll get into these immutable backups in particular here in a second, Detection. Now, Veeam can't be all things to all people. I'll admit that. But we do have some detection techniques that can help you, even for free, by the way. And then some response. How do you get out of this problem? What type of options are in place? What type of predefined plans are in place? And then recovery, getting out of that problem, right? So we can definitely align to that framework if you're familiar with this model. And back to where I started, right? Those capabilities over on the right are right there. And I kind of flip those around and say, well, this is a bunch of capabilities, I know. But the reality is detection, strategy, capabilities, and restore, right? You can just walk down the line, whether it's a framework, whether it's a sequence of time. Each of these different points over here on the right are Veeam capabilities. Now, I'm not going to go through them all. I have some links at the end of the webinar that you can go and get more information on this. In fact, my flagship piece of content for this year was a white paper that I wrote, basically going top to bottom on those capabilities. But I want to highlight a couple of them. The first is detection. So Veeam 1, I don't know if any of you have heard of Veeam 1 or are using Veeam 1. I like to say that I guarantee you Veeam 1 will tell you something about your environment that you didn't know, but you need to address. And that can also include ransomware. The possible ransomware activity alarm is available in the free edition. Oh, did I say free? That's right. There is a free edition of this product. You can go download it with the community edition, and you can monitor your VMware or Hyper-V environment for ransomware activity. So a great detection technique that is looking for sustained CPU activity with writes. That's one type of ransomware behavior. This is also adjustable if you want to think about incorporating other types of metrics to look at. And then if you're using Veeam for backups, we can also do some analysis. I'm not going to go so far as to call it machine learning, but let's just say interpretation of your previous backups to then come back and say, look, your incrementals, meaning your daily run of your backup, is suspiciously large. So something might be up, right? So my thought is we can have some detection techniques. I love talking to the support team here at Veeam. We have a dedicated group that deals with it every day, deals with ransomware every day. When I ask them, and I ask them like quarterly for their updated advice, and the number one thing that they say is ultra resilient copies of data, multiple copies of their backups. That's the best line of defense. You know, the reality is sometimes ransomware gets the best of organizations. I'm sure Charlie has seen it. I've talked to organizations as well that have been in a bad side of the equation. By having multiple resilient copies, that is your best single line of defense, without a doubt. And I'll show you how to get there in a second. To Charlie's point about the multi-factor, right? Permissions and hardening, that's a very good aligned piece of advice right there. Our Veeam support team sees incidents where an account gets compromised over in production and then it falls over into the backup infrastructure. To Charlie's point about two-factor authentication, absolutely have it on your backup infrastructure resources. I'd even go so far as to say everything, honestly, even internal network. When you think about Dwell and the potential that I shared from Threat Post about being walked in, etc. Two-factor every day, all the way. And then separation of resources. So logical separation, internal firewalling specifically for the backup infrastructure, or even just for the storage of the backup infrastructure. These can be very effective. And then to the points that I highlighted earlier, right, we can really mitigate some of those big ones with two-factor authentication, no internet access for your backup infrastructure, minimal permissions, protecting endpoints. Those types of things can walk you into being more protected. Oh, data labs, the third point. This is a fun one. I mentioned that just having software updates and patching is a really good way to be resilient against some of the different threats. Well, sometimes people say, well, I can't patch because this system's too complicated, too critical, too fiddlesome. Well, the Veeam Data Lab is something you should check out. The Veeam Data Lab is a really good way to test upgrades updates, patching, security changes. If you haven't ever um, been familiar with a Veeam data lab or a virtual lab, I highly encourage you to check it out. It's probably the most complicated part of Veeam technology. Won't admit it or won't deny that. Realistically, I tell users that if you spent 4 hours learning this, it'll save you 40 in your first year. And I'm not over exaggerating on that. What I mean is that it'll save you changes failing. For example, if you say, I need a maintenance window of this critical app to do something, and then you start it, and then you find out it takes longer than you thought, and then you have to start over, or you didn't know you needed to do this ahead of time because you couldn't test it. Those are the problems we're going to solve. Check that out. Now, I have a customer, hopefully that's you, eventually here at Veeam, white paper that explains that, so you can check that out. All right, my number one piece of advice, some form of ultra resilient backup media. So I made up a word. So Charlie, I need your opinion. I made up this word, ultra resilient. Am I talking jello, or is that actually a good word?
I think it's pretty good.
Okay.
I
So,
like it.
okay, I've made it up, but I think the main important note is that it's different characteristics. And especially if you think about the lighter green ones, tape, immutable backups, rotating hard drives, insider protection. These are basically out of band, they're air gapped, or they're offline from really the threat. So there's an inherent recoverability with these different media types. And I'll give some sideways shouts to replication and primary storage snapshots, especially if you're talking about some of the newer advanced ones that are specific for ransomware threats, name dropping Exagrid's retention lock, safe mode snapshots from pure storage, and like NetApp SnapLock. Those are three examples. So the cool one is the immutable backups in the cloud, okay? And I've got a picture for that here in a second. And then tape, well, everyone has a story of tape. Not all of them are good, but you can't deny the offline element, its portability, and the cost effectiveness per terabyte or an acquisition cost are pretty low. But that being said, I kind of favor the immutable backups in the cloud or the Veeam Cloud Connect Insider Protection, which is a completely different authentication mechanism. And I see a lot of organizations being saved by our service providers with the insider protection. So have some, at least one, maybe more copies of your backup data on something like this, and that will be a very effective technique. Okay, so I mentioned the immutable backups. That's kind of new. So let me quickly explain that. Here at Veeam, we have this technology called the SOBR, the Scale Out Backup Repository. You can have one or more different storage resources aggregated to what's called a performance tier. Now, some of you might say, Rick, dedupe appliance performance, are you sure? It's a logical construct. The performance tier will allow you to have some policy engines, like full backups go on the dedupe appliance, increments go on the network attached storage, or you could even get into things like just spread them out, or you could get into things like, I don't have a dedupe appliance, I have a bunch of network attached storage. You can logically pair 3 or 4 of those. Mix and match doesn't matter. It's a logical construct. The magic here is that if any one of the underlying storage systems are offline, it'll still take your backup for you. That's the cool part. But we've enhanced it over the years. Let's see, about a year and a half ago, almost 2 years ago, we implemented what's called the capacity tier. Now, the capacity tier is a technique that leverages object storage, whether it's Amazon S3 in the cloud, Azure Blob, IBM Cloud Object Storage, as well as S3 compatible storage systems, Wasabi, Cloudian, etc. And some of these, namely Amazon S3, but also some of the S3 compatible ones, have object lock. So if you're not familiar with S3 types of storage, object lock, and then its compliance mode, you can get into something that's really, really powerful. It basically means I can put a backup in the cloud and I can't delete it. I can't change it. It's immutable. So couple that with the scale out backup repository, I can put either the oldest backups or the most recent ones into this locked bucket, and it's immutable. And the benefits here is that this is completely a policy-based engine. It's completely transparent. When we say space efficient, it's actually implementing a storage efficiency. We're not going to call it deduplication, but it prevents duplication. Okay, it had to take me a long time to think how to explain that. Internally, we're calling it no dupe. Okay, but basically, we're sharing metadata, and if blocks exist in one place on the performance tier, and those are transcended into the cloud as pages and blobs and stuff, we actually have a way to share with metadata those references to those pages. So we won't, for one, duplicate data in object storage, but for cost reasons. But for two, it'll really help you on egress. Okay, it's not deduplication, prevents duplication. Let's call it no dupe. And the other thing is, it's very intelligent for no extra costs. In fact, it was built with cloud economics as an equal priority to performance. In fact, you can do instant VM recovery from this. It's really awesome. Whew. And there's no cost for this from Veeam. Oh, interesting. If you're using Veeam, you can use this technology today. Now, we're not going to pay your cloud bill. It's a different conversation for the storage side, but there's no quote unquote Veeam tax to use this. A lot of information here. The final 3 links that I want to share with you are some of the Veeam different pieces that we have here. One is the Ransomware Assessment Kit that you can go online and get, ransomware education site, as well as our content library that has like white papers, including the one that I mentioned. You can consume all of this content. When we say customer facing, that means you as a customer, or some of you may be partners of Veeam, you can up your technical game here and go from there. So with that concludes kind of my side of it. And I wanted to pass it back over to David to see if we had any questions.
Absolutely. Yeah. Great presentation, Rick and Charlie. Really cool stuff. Hot topic that's affecting so many companies out there, way too many companies. So solid advice. We do have some questions for you. Let's see. I've put these in the queue. There's a lot of questions, a lot of good questions. One of them that caught my eye comes from Edward. He's asking, how do we protect the Veeam backup files? Is there some way to ensure that our backup repository isn't susceptible to ransomware?
Yeah, good call, Edward. So I would recommend, and I'd again point to the white paper links that I had up there, a hardened Veeam deployment, right? So don't just have your backup infrastructure sitting on the network next to and like everything else. When I talk to organizations who have been through a ransomware incident, and they always make changes afterwards, and actually I'll pass the second half of that over to Charlie here in a second, but they always make changes afterwards. And so I recommend implementing your backup infrastructure as an outsider looking in with a very important role. I'm going to go do the backup. So explicit minimal permissions, no internet access, ports just for this and that. And that's all well documented over at the Veeam website. But really put that backup infrastructure on an island to do one thing and explicitly shape that permission in and out. Charlie, any advice on that as well?
Well, I think you nailed it, and also in an earlier slide with making sure that the authentication mechanism is a different one than the typical day-to-day production network. That's key, and I have seen situations where that hasn't been the case, and that's caused issues. So yeah, definitely out on an island using a different authentication mechanism. Those are absolutely key.
Good stuff.
Another question here comes from Eric. He's asking, are there any actual laws or regulations around simply paying the ransom?
I'm not an attorney, though I am married to one. I'll also get Charlie's opinion, who consults a lot with the legal space. But that's an emerging topic. I've learned a whole bunch in the last month about this. I'm not quite ready to go promoting legal advice on this yet, but I will say that that's something that may be a scenario where there are legal implications. And I also have found out that if you did pay it, it's tax deductible. Crazy stuff. Charlie, are you seeing anything in your legal circles around that?
Yeah, I think ultimately it boils down to a business decision in terms of if that is a last resort, irrespective of any kind of rules or regulations. That's what the organization is going to do and deal with the consequences as a result. I have not seen any situations where, and again, definitely not a lawyer and don't pretend to play one, although I have worked with plenty of them. I haven't seen a situation where an organization has been penalized per se for paying.
Okay. Okay. Excellent advice. Uh, Alexander is asking, is the Eset free online scanner safe and reliable? I think you said you tried that out, Rick.
That's my favorite of the three, Alexander. Reliable, yes, it never let me down. Safe, I trust these tools in the space, and I work backwards to Leo at the PC security channel. He's got every single one of them out there documented, and I'd argue maybe even more of a actual opinion there. That you go to Leo's page, and there will be some that I won't go so far as to say doesn't recommend, but clearly indicates one or more of these are not at a level of the others, right? So, Alexander, I'd actually just refer you over to the PC security channel, look up the 1, 2, or 3 that you're using or like, and get Leo's opinion on it.
Excellent. Another question, John is asking, what's the name of the Veeam product you mentioned related to testing patches?
So that's part of Veeam backup and replication, and it is called a virtual lab. We gave it a marketing word of data labs because it's kind of cool, data labbing, but it's a virtual lab, which is part of Veeam backup and replication, that you can isolate virtual machines and do testing. You can test security things on them. You can test recoveries, all kinds of stuff, but the virtual lab.
Excellent. And so that's just included. That's not a separate license.
Licensing. It's like
Or a
David. It's
separate
like
product.
no, it's not a separate product, but it's like commercials for
Okay.
cars. Okay, MSRP this, as shown that. I can cut my own licenses, so I live in Enterprise Plus world. So we document the different functionality levels. One thing I will say is it's not available in our community edition, which is the free product, but it is available in a free
Got it.
trial.
Okay. Next question from Edward here. He's asking if a Hyper-V server is attacked and held by ransomware. Are all virtual machines locked?
Can be. I spoke to an organization that had that very thing happen. In fact, the Veeam on session in June, all Hyper-V systems were compromised. And the way they were not going to let that happen again was a separate management fabric and authentication framework for that Hyper-V infrastructure, a separate authentication and management fabric for their backup infrastructure, and then their production workloads start doing what they need to do. And Charlie, on your side, do you kind of get into advising organizations how to separate and segment like that, or maybe even a different angle as well?
Yeah, no, 100%. That's correct. Segmentation is absolutely key. What I've seen in the wild is that these, different ransomwares are very aggressive. If they can reach something on that network segment, it will certainly attempt to encrypt.
So network security, network segmentation is excellent advice there to implement. Another question here. What are some common mistakes that you see people making in the cloud related to security or ransomware?
Yeah, so the cloud doesn't change some of the responsibilities. It changes the knowledge requirements and the tool sets That's my opinion. So I love the leaky bucket phenomena. You can find people that have public S3 buckets that are not secured, right? That's not the headline you want to be in. The cloud is in, Azure, Amazon, IBM Cloud, Tencent, Ali Cloud, Oracle Cloud, Google Cloud. They all have this mindset, I think, that you should take into it of you should work very diligently with that in mind. And I would say, if anything, it's taking that cloud security as a priority, because how you consume the services, a lot of times, especially me, I grew up on-prem and data center, right? And then the cloud came in later. So I go to the cloud to consume one or more services. Like I need Azure storage, I need Azure VMs. But consequently, I have inherently a requirement to know things like networking and security for Azure, regardless of what services I use. So free tip here is use Azure Advisor. In the Azure example, I just got my Microsoft MVP back. Woo, woo. But anyways, Azure Advisor is a great way to start and end every session into the Azure portal. Log in, see what you've got as a recommendation or an alert, and then do what you need to do. And then before you're done, go back into Azure Advisor and make sure nothing new has come in. And I think being in a tool like that, and Azure Advisor and the other clouds have technologies like that as well, you can make sure that you're if you take Azure Advisor, for example, it has security recommendations, best practices optimizations, and a couple others. But the security and best practices ones will guide you to the red flags, which are the entry points for threats. And this could then lead you to avoiding a ransomware threat as well. So in fact, over at checkyourlogs.net, I've been writing a bunch about Azure storage and security for that very reason. So that's a loaded question there, but the reality is the tooling changes, but kind of the mindset and the responsibility don't. I don't know, Charlie, if you want to add anything to that.
No, I think you hit the nail on the head there. You just want to make sure, as you would with an on-prem environment, that you're taking the appropriate, precautionary steps to make sure the environment is hardened. Just because it's in the cloud doesn't mean that those rules don't apply per se. And I think, Rick, a couple of those specific examples that you mentioned are great resources.
I'm afraid we're running out of time, though, in our live Q&A session here on the event. I want to wrap this up on time. I know Rick likes to be on time. So before we go, one final question for both of you. Rick, if people want to learn more about this topic, what do you recommend?
I think the Veeam resources here are a good start for sure. And then over at the front, you can reach out to both Charlie and myself privately for, myself for Veeam info, and, Charlie for, that cybersecurity type of persona. But I like to say it all starts at veeam.com. You can do that.
Excellent. And Charlie, any final words or how to reach you at DP3 Tech?
Yeah, I guess just my final piece of advice would be, it's always better to be proactive than reactive. We covered a lot, but there are some very actionable steps that you can take today to help prevent, your organization. And I'm always willing and excited to have conversations about, these topics specifically. So please don't hesitate to reach out. You could track me down on Twitter. And thanks again for the opportunity to be here today with everybody.
Absolutely. Yeah. Thank you so much, Rick. Thank you, Charlie. Really great presentations. So much actionable advice, very educational. Very much appreciate that. Thank you to everyone at Veeam for all the excellent resources you see there on the screen. Again, don't forget about the handouts tab. It's there that you'll find the link to register for the upcoming Veeam Live event. That's going to be really cool, completely live event. You don't want to miss that. And also, you can download the slides that have the links you see there on the screen, as well as the rest of the presentation that you saw today. And before we go, I want to announce the winner of our Amazon $300 gift card. That's going to Matthew Snell from Washington. Congratulations, Matthew Snell from Washington. Again, thank you to Veeam for supporting today's event, and thank you to everyone out there in our audience for joining us. Hope you learned a lot. Have a great day. Bye-bye.